John F. Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts on May 29, 1917, second child out of 9 with 5 sisters and 3 brothers. John's father was known for being a businessman and having high-profile positions in the United States government. John's mother was a college-educated woman. She was a magnet of the family. She loved politics, spoke many languages, and was an accomplished pianist. She lived until she was 104. One of the significant family members was Eunice. She started a foundation and underwrote the first International Special Olympics Summer Games in 1968. Robert Kennedy served in the Navy during World War II and received his degree in government from Harvard University. In 1960, he was the manager of his brother's presidential campaign. After the election, he was appointed Attorney General in President Kennedy's cabinet. After his brother's death, he ran for U.S. Senate from New York. He created programs that are still running today. Unfortunately, he was fatally shot on June 5, 1968, shortly after claiming victory in the state's crucial Democratic primary. He was 42 years old. Jean Kennedy is the only living family member of the Kennedys. She became a political figure in her own right 3 decades after 1960 when President Clinton nominated her to be U.S. Ambassador to Ireland on March 17, 1993. She continued her duties that June until 1998. She received many honorary degrees and promotes awareness and advocacy in the field of mental retardation. John, nicknamed Jack, was very popular and had many friends at Choate, a boarding school for teenage boys in Connecticut. He played tennis, football, basketball, and golf. He also enjoyed reading too. He didn't always work as hard as he could, except in history and English, which were his favorite subjects. Jack graduated from Choate and entered Harvard in 1936. Late in 1937, Mr. Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to England and moved there with his whole family besides Joe, Jack's brother, and himself, who were at Harvard. Because of his father's job, Jack became very interested in European politics and world affairs. One of his major advisors include Ted Sorensen, who was John's speechwriter and one of his closest advisors. Lyndon B. Johnson was John's vice president, who was sworn in hours after John's assassination. Robert McNamara was John's Secretary of Defense, who played a major role in the Vietnam War and revamped Pentagon operations. One of his major adversaries was before his inauguration, JFK was briefed on a plan that anticipated support from the Cuban people and elements of the Cuban military that would lead to the overthrow of Castro and the establishment of a non-communist government. The entire force was either killed or captured, and Kennedy took full responsibility for the failure of the operation. So, he was a good guy. During the presidential elections between Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon, there was a lot of drama between them two. When Kennedy won, Nixon was furious and claimed in an autobiography that widespread fraud happened in Illinois and Texas during the 1960 election. Fortunately, Nixon became president 2 elections down the line. Some military conflicts JFK had was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He tried to de-escalate the potential war with the Soviet Union. Then he also committed to help the Middle East not fall under communism while still allowing them to take military matters into their own hands. John fought for black people during the Civil Rights Act. He hosted many African diplomats from the newly made nations in Africa. He also tried to appoint African Americans to high-level positions in his administration. He spoke out in favor of school desegregation and tried to get blacks the right to vote. The domestic affairs Kennedy had to face was the problems with the economy. Kennedy pursued legislation to lower taxes, protect the unemployed, increase the minimum wage, and energize the business and housing sectors. He took his advisors' advice, and the economy slowly made its way back up. The president also proposed new social programs. Attempts to cut taxes and broaden civil rights were watered down on Capitol Hill. Southern Democrats killed the proposal for a Department of Urban Affairs because they thought Kennedy would appoint an African American as his first secretary. Foreign affairs that President Kennedy had to deal with was him creating the Peace Corps by executive order in 1961. Through the promotion of modernization and development, Peace Corps volunteers sought to improve social and economic conditions throughout the world. Their work also supported Kennedy's efforts in the Cold War battle for hearts and minds. The program proved enduring. By the end of the 20th century, the Peace Corps had sent more than 170,000 American volunteers to over 135 nations. Just months before his death, Kennedy secured an agreement with Britain and the Soviet Union to limit testing of nuclear weapons in space, underwater, and in the Earth's atmosphere. Not only did it seek to reduce hazardous nuclear quote-unquote fallout, it also signaled the success of Kennedy's efforts to engage the Soviet Union in constructive negotiations and reduce Cold War tensions, a goal captured most famously in his June 1963 remarks at American University. In the wake of the close call over Cuba, Kennedy considered this agreement his greatest accomplishment as president. John lived his life in pain. He had chronic back problems and Addison's disease, a hormonal disorder that causes fatigue and compromises the immune system. In 1947, he was gravely ill from England. In 1951, while running a high fever in Japan, and following back surgery in 1954. According to historian Robert Dallek, if the public had known about Kennedy's ill health, he probably never would have been elected president. Soon after graduating from Harvard, him and his brother Joe joined the Navy. On the night of August 2, 1943, a Japanese destroyer suddenly became visible. The much larger Japanese warship rammed his ship, splitting it in half and killing 2 of Lieutenant Kennedy's men. Lieutenant Kennedy was slammed hard against the cockpit, once again injuring his weak back. Even though John was a charismatic fellow in the public eye didn't mean his loyalty was up to par. He had at least 9 affairs, including with Marilyn Monroe. The sad part about it was that his wife knew about them. She mentioned that where she grew up, a lot of men cheated on their wives, so she was used to it. She still loved him though. Kennedy was the youngest president to be elected and the youngest one to die. While in Dallas, shots rang out and he was seriously wounded and died a short time later. Jackie was on the back of the car because she was retrieving fragments from the president's head. His cause of death was gunshot wound to the skull.